Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is DC Councilmember Zachary Parker. Councilmember, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get into DC's criminal code reform, which is why you're here, I would like you to explain what the DC Council is and how it works.
DC, as many know, is a city that in many ways functions as a state. So the DC Council is the District of Columbia's legislative body that operates and covers a wide range of legislative and budgetary matters.
I know that you just began serving as council member earlier this year, but the council passed the revised Criminal Code Act of 2022 late last year. Why do you think that the council thought it was necessary to change the district's laws around crime?
There were several reasons why it was necessary to update the district's criminal code. It had not been updated since 1901, and therefore it was largely outdated. There were many regulated books won't relate to modern day society. There are also relics of a past era, if you will, on the books, namely around mandatory minimums. And there were sentencing regulations that were not proportional to the crimes that we're seeing in the district. And so this criminal code rewrite sought to address all of those things and more.
Can you get into that? What sentencing mandates do you think needed updating?
Yeah, well, there are several. So as I mentioned, the criminal code rewrite got rid of mandatory minimums, which many will, and research tells us, disproportionately impact Black and Brown residents. There were heightened penalties for murder and some gun charges. There were adjustments made to penalties for carjacking and other crimes. And while there is a lot of misinformation around lessening, the rewrite was to bring those penalties into proportion with one another, based on what we're seeing the judiciary actually reference and sentence criminals to, but that is also in line with what a lot of other states are already doing.
You're a Democrat. As you know, Republicans have long accused Democrats of being soft on crime. How is this reform combating rising crime?
In a number of key ways. Research tells us that the longer the sentence actually doesn't deter violence. And in fact, it is making sure that there is clarity around the penalties, that we're actually holding those that break the law accountable, and that we are providing pathways to rehabilitation. By updating the criminal code, we're doing a few things. One, making sure that we can reflect what we're seeing in the data currently. And as I mentioned, we actually heightened the penalties in some respects. There is better education around accountability, and there is room for rehabilitation. The Second Amendment, or rather the second chance laws within the criminal code rewrite, is an opportunity for folk that may have messed up in their teens to have a second chance at life after paying restitution of sorts. And so, again, I go by saying that this criminal code rewrite, while it's gotten a lot of attention and there is a lot of misinformation surrounding it, is in alignment with what our U.S. Attorney's Office, our Attorney General's office, and many other states have recommended and are already doing.
I do want to talk about a phrase you keep saying, that there's a lot of misinformation swirling around this resolution. Congress voted to reverse this. So do you think that the council did a really good job of communicating that what you're saying is the need for this resolution?
I mean, the reality is that we are approaching an election season, and we see a dysfunctional House of Representatives that seized on an opportunity to point fingers and make hay out of the district's criminal code rewrite. It is important to note that we have not decriminalized any laws such as carjacking. And in fact, a penalty for carjacking still carries 30 years in prison. It's hard to suggest that that is decriminalizing that crime. But what we have said is that it is important that we bring that law or that crime and punishment in proportion related to other crimes like murder. We heightened the penalties for murder. We heightened the penalties for a number of other things. And so it just doesn't bear the fact that we have decriminalized crimes in the district.
What would your response be to Republicans who are saying this is an example of Democrats being soft on crime?
If you talk to any resident in the district, they will tell you that rising violence and crime is a concern, as it is for every one of my colleagues on the DC Council. And I happen to believe the best way to counter crime and violence is to prevent it and address the root causes of violence and crime. When we're talking about expanding our carceral system, locking folk up after the fact, it is still not dealing with the situation that someone had already been carjacked or murdered. And as I said, we are already holding folk accountable to lengthier sentences now, more so than any other state in the country. And so you would expect that the district would be among the safest states in the country. But again, research tells us that just because you have a longer sentence doesn't mean you're deterring folks from crime. It is that we have to focus on the root causes of crime. Yes, we have to hold people accountable, which this criminal code rewrite does. And we have to provide opportunities for folk to choose a better path.
Congress in February voted to reverse this DC legislation, and now it's also poised to fail in the Senate. Did you ever expect this bill to really garner this national debate, the president's involved, Congress is involved, and for it to be so controversial?
I would say no, I didn't anticipate that this would garner the level of attention that it has. This legislation has been researched for years. There have been ample opportunities for feedback, again, from the U.S. Attorney's Office, our Attorney General's office. There is research and multitudes of documents citing and referencing the importance of every penalty and aspect of this criminal code rewrite. What is really at play here is that the District of Columbia is still treated as a subject of Congress's hopes and whims, and district residents are treated as second-class citizens in many respects. And regardless of where you stand on the matter of the district's criminal code rewrite, I believe firmly, and so do so many of my neighbors, that we should have the right to self-governance. That's really what is at play here. Again, it is an election season, and when you haven't accomplished much, as I would suggest is the case for many of the House Republicans, it's easy to make hay around things that make for good sound bites, but that it just doesn't pass muster or bear out the facts.
I do want to get into the larger conversation of statehood in just a moment, but your colleague, DC Council Chairman Phil Mendelson, said Monday he was withdrawing the criminal justice bill. Do you agree with his position here?
I do agree with the chairman's decision, and I think is yet another example of how the council has operated in good faith, wanting to partner and exchange ideas with others, to hear feedback, to make sure that this was an iterative process, to make sure that the criminal code rewrite reflected the views and the feedback that we received from a wide range of folk. And by withdrawing it, it was another chance for us to do just that. It is my understanding that the Senate is still going to go forth with a vote, which is certainly in their purview to do. But we are still left with an outdated criminal code here in the district. And 700 residents in the District of Columbia still go without representation in Congress. And so the fundamental issue here is that while many are making political hay out of this case, our criminal code is still outdated. The penalties that we have on the books are not meeting the crimes that we have and are seeing in the city. And district residents are still being left out of the ideals and the promises of our democracy.
So is it back to the drawing board with the criminal code, or is this something that is just scrapped?
I think it's too early to say. I certainly will hope that it's not scrapped, but I believe my colleagues and I will have to go back to the drawing board to reflect on this moment and all that we've heard and learned. And I'm truly hopeful that we can put forth a criminal code rewrite 2.0 of sorts to make the district safer and bring our criminal code into modern day society.
President Biden said he would not veto the Republicans' decision to override the criminal code reform. I want you to discuss how that made you feel.
The president is in a tough position here. And again, it is an election. And I have to opine on the president's motives. But what I will say, it is hard to square the president's commitment to local self-governance for the district and siding with House and Senate Republicans that would want to utilize every opportunity to undermine home rule and self-governance. And so while it's disappointing, I think the focus for me and my colleagues is on how do we take this moment, reflect on it, and put forth a new and updated criminal code rewrite.
I know you said you didn't want to opine on the president's motives here, but do you think his decision was more of a 2024 re-election move opposed to his actual stance on crime?
I can only take the president at his words, and he said he didn't agree with the criminal code rewrite. It was curious that he did reference similar talking points as to House Republicans. And so I can only take that at face value. What I would say is that I would encourage the president and others to read the legislation and go in depth and actually engage with members of the council. We have not had an opportunity to share our perspective and or engage with the White House on this matter. I appreciate those senators and representatives who have been vocal to defend home rule and the district's right to self-governance. And again, I think from here, rather than pointing a finger and or shaming and blaming, our focus needs to be on the next steps to keep the district safe and updating the criminal code.
President Biden's decision there was really the nail in the coffin to the criminal code reform as we know it. Do you think his decision here hinders DC's push toward statehood?
I don't think so. I think the president has remained consistent in his voicing support for DC statehood, as have many in the Senate and the House. I think what we're seeing here is the challenges that we face on the day-to-day basis in the district of Congress interfering with district laws. And so I'm hopeful that this serves as an opportunity for us to bring the temperature down, to talk about the path forward, and for us to hopefully find a pathway for DC statehood in the years in the future.
You did say we are in the midst, at the beginning of an election cycle here. Do you still support President Biden? I know he hasn't officially announced a 2024 re-election bid, but would you support him should he run?
I am a Democrat, and I support President Biden as our Democratic president. I actually think he has many successful items to run on. And given the alternative, which would have been former President Trump, I think many would agree that we won out in that scenario with President Biden. Should he announce his bid for re-election, even despite all of this, I do look forward to supporting President Biden.
Councilmember, one final question. What do you say to the lawmakers, both Democrats and Republicans, who are against this revised criminal code?
I would several things I would say. We are seeing violence and crime spike across the country. And I don't think that is by happen chance, given how lax our national gun laws are, but also that we are emerging from a global pandemic. I believe it is this presents us an opportunity to address the root causes of violence. And here in the district, we are wanting to focus on the facts and what research has long proved, that the best way to keep our community safe is to prevent crime before it happens. In the instances where we have to hold folk accountable, I believe this criminal code that we've put forth does just that. And it is my hope that wherever folk are on this debate, that we can all agree that DC is entitled to self-governance. And so I hope with that, I welcome those who are willing to work with all of us here at the DC Council as we move forward from this unfortunate circumstance.
And what's next here? Is this still a top priority?
I believe it is a top priority. There are many challenges facing the district as we emerge from the pandemic, as we fight to rebuild, as is the case for many cities and jurisdictions. We are approaching our budget cycle and season here in the district. And so this will certainly be a footnote of the broader conversation of how we move forward. But I don't want to get too far ahead of my colleagues, but I would certainly hope that there is a path forward for us to update the district's criminal code.
Councilmember Zachary Parker, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.